Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Homage to the Buddha, the blessed, noble, and fully self-awakened one. I've chosen this topic of courage, but I mean, really, what we're talking about is fear, isn't it? Overcoming fear. Now, fear is, I would argue, is the most fundamental of our emotional states, dependent on delusion. Yeah. So this delusion of a self, it's created a self which feels uncertain because, sickness, aging, and death, and all that, and therefore it has this fear about itself, and it reacts to this fear by making itself safe, and that's when we start accumulating stuff. So money makes us feel safe. We've got a big bank account, lots of friends, and power, of course, and lots of pleasurable things to do. So we keep our mind off these horrible things. So this fear of death, or fear of sickness, etc., aging, and all that, it has this effect of making us try to escape it. And of course, this is one of the great awakeners, that this was the awakener, the awakeners that drove the Buddha to seek liberation, sickness, aging, and death. So it obviously plays a big part in our lives, and it shapes our behavior. When we're in any situation which is dangerous or stressful or in any way a challenge. So it's something we need to deal with, and I'm sure all of you have to some extent or other. And it won't go, you see, until the very last moment when the self is destroyed. So it's going to be with us for a while. And we have to see it as a friend. I mean, after all, it is trying to protect us, right? And so we have to give it a hug, and then we have to sort of open up to it, get the feel of it, and not run away from it. So of course that running away from it is the panic, isn't it? So if we consider the amount of fear that we have as a measure of the delusion of self, every time we undermine this fear, we're undermining the delusion of self, right? So there is a plus to it. And in fact, the Buddha in the Dhammapada, verse 39, tells us that in the end, all fear would disappear. This is what he says. For one who has awakened, whose mind isn't agitated, whose heart isn't tormented, and who has abandoned both merit and demerit, fear does not exist. So once the mind has been silenced and the heart calmed, and there's no attempt to create karma based on a self, me creating stuff, then fear is completely gone. So the prognosis is good. This is what we have to keep remembering. Now, psychologists have delineated 6 areas of experience where we experience fear. And I'm indebted to Gwen for this, who runs the monthly meeting on climate change, climate crisis. So it's the physical, the social, moral, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. This is sometimes where we need to find a certain level of courage. So the physical, I think, is pretty straightforward, just straightforward, the fear of pain, fear of debilitating illness, etc. So whenever that touches us, we come across this fear, and it's being able to sit with the fear, allow it to arise, pass away. That's the courage, the internal courage. Of course, some people have to find that physical courage in daily life. I'm thinking of sports. A lot of sports demand physical courage, especially boxing. I don't know if any of you have a I've done a bit of boxing, but you definitely got to have a bit of physical courage there. And then there are occupations, soldiering. If we think of what's happening now in the Ukraine, both sides demands a physical courage. Even the police at sometimes need that. So this identity with the body is profound. Yeah, I mean, you can't be here without one. So, I mean, it's the physical representation of our existence. So it's important that we, whenever this comes to us, that we really turn towards it, see it as a friend, see it that it's actually trying to protect us, and almost get comfortable with the feelings of fear. That's the big thing. Not to push it away. So we may use that as a sort of questions of ourselves. Has there been a time in our lives when we've been physically timid, when we should have done something? And how do we feel about that? Is there some guilt and shame that we haven't worked through? And then, to make these silent inward resolutions that if it's demanded of us, we'll do our best to manifest courage. So that's the physical part. The social part, usually it's to do with feeling embarrassed in a meeting. So you don't want to ask a question in case people think it's silly and stuff like that. So we're afraid of criticism, saying something which other people will jump down our throats for, things like that. Even sort of expressing ourselves to neighbors, to a neighbor whom has a different opinion or a different understanding. So that sort of social courage is sometimes, sometimes that really we have to try to express. So, I mean, obviously we have great examples of that, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, all these people who are out on demonstrations, which are getting to be more and more policed and more danger of being fined and sent to prison. And of course, when you think of countries and the amount of courage you need, like, for instance, that terrible time in Iran, where the morality police murdered that young woman, and the tremendous repressive measures that the government took, even capturing people and then hanging them. We've got, of course, Russia. So you've got a man called Kara-Murza, who is a political activist, journalist, author, filmmaker, political prisoner. So he spoke against the present war, and he's ended up in jail for 25 years. And unless Putin is somehow got rid of, he's going to be there for 25 years. And then, of course, there's that Russian opposition leader, Navalny, who's, I think, tremendously courageous. It's unbelievable, really, whom Putin actually tried to poison. Even if you look back into Russian history, the misery of the Russians is unbelievable. I don't think it's quite remarkable, and yet they find this courage through. If you remember Stalin's time, when the samizdat, when they were writing poems and all sorts of stuff and passing it on bits of paper to friends, trying to keep the resistance alive. And of course, there's the investigative journalist, the 67 been murdered last year. The most prominent, of course, was when the Israeli forces murdered Shireen Abu Akleh in the occupied West Bank. It's awful, awful, awful. So again, it's just, social courage. It's again an opportunity for us to contemplate where, we haven't made our views known out of fear of criticism or whatever, being mocked, attacked. And again, there might be some shame or guilt around that. So you have to work through it, you have to allow it to come up. And then to make that resolution, should I find myself in such a situation, I'll make my understandings known. Yeah? Sort of shading into that is moral courage, which is more to do with right and wrong, And I'm reminded now of the 60s, which of course is prehistoric now. But we had a person in the UK called Mary Whitehouse who really led the charge against the loss of moral compass. In those days, it was called permissiveness, and people were getting very upset about it. And of course, we did lose the moral ground. We found out about the behavior of the famous DJ, Jimmy Savile, and then the Catholic priests and all that, and paedophiles. So it was all, I mean, there was something happened in the 60s which sort of took away sort of a grounding that we used to have as a society in morality. But of course, these situations are never absolutely white and black. Sometimes it's quite difficult to decide. Then we have things like abortion, which in Europe is now sort of a dead subject, really. But we can see the tremendous war that's going on in the United States over it. And the usual sort of battle between the mother's rights and the right of the fetus. And I think more upfront these days for us is immigration and the impact it's having on society. And no one has a clue. I mean, I haven't a clue as to what the answer is to the growing level of immigration. And if when climate change really begins to bite, presumably it's going to get much worse. So these people are coming out of areas of abject poverty and almost unlivable. And on top of that, there's the political refugees. So of course, the danger here is that it pushes society to the indigenous society, we can say, to defend itself and move over towards fascist regimes, which is happening. We've got Orban in Poland, we've got Meloni in Italy. And this comes out of fear, but it's something that if we want to maintain a liberal society, something we really have to tackle. So again, there's this whole area of morality which demands courage. And has there been a time in the past we could have been more morally courageous? And again, to make that resolution. The next one is the emotional courage. Well, that points to opening up to these very difficult mental states that we have within ourselves, and that's of course very much part of our practice of Vipassana, just to allow very difficult mental states to arise and to be able to see the aversion that we have to it, the fear that we have to it, and just to allow that to pass away. And then just to sit quietly with it, to sort of sink into the fire, tie ourselves to the bonfire and just allow it to rage. And we do that because that's the healing. Once these emotions have a chance to liberate themselves, they do. Of course, what we mistake is that when we begin to create these stories in the mind, and it feels like a relief. If you're angry and you go off onto a fantasy of beating somebody up, then it feels like a relief, but actually it's just exercised the anger. It's when you feel it as a physical sensation that it's actually being released. So this, of course, we know through our Vipassana. And there's a little passage here that I've copied from the Buddha, who had to tackle fear when he first went out into the jungles. And while I was staying there, a wild animal would come, or a peacock would make a twig fall. The wind would rustle the falling leaves, and the thought would occur to me, is this that fear and terror coming? And then the thought occurred to me, why do I just keep waiting for fear and terror? So instead of that, this is what he determines. What if I, in whatever state I'm in, when fear and terror come to me, were to subdue that fear and terror in that very state? So when fear and terror came to me while I was walking backwards and forwards, I would not sit down or stand or lie down. I would keep walking backwards and forward until I had pacified the fear and terror. When fear and terror came to me while I was standing, I would not walk or sit or lie down. I would keep standing until I had subdued the fear and terror. And when fear and terror came to me while sitting, I would not lie down or stand up or walk. I would keep sitting until I had subdued that fear and terror. When terror and fear came to me while I was lying down, I would not sit up or stand or walk. I'd keep lying down until I had subdued the fear and terror. So in other words, he turned towards it. Yeah. The word subdue does suggest some sort of suppression, but that's not what he means. So again, if we have a specific mental state that arises that we find very difficult, to find, if it comes up at a convenient time when it's just you by yourself, whatever, just to be able to move into it and stay with it. And then there's the intellectual. So here, oops, just a minute, we've got something wrong here. Then there's the intellectual. So recently here in the UK, we had a Professor Kathleen Stock, who's a philosopher and a gender critical academic. And she's been hounded out of the university that she worked in. And there was a whole rumpus at the Oxford University asking her to be cancelled. And she basically stated in her book that trans women are not, it's difficult to say, are not the same as born women. Let's put it that way. So that's created quite a rumpus, and of course she lost the job and everything from it. So this whole area is one where people, have to have the courage to speak their truth, you might say. It's a sort of dodgy area because it depends which way you're looking at it. One of the should we say, paradoxes of this particular argument is nobody complains about a woman who becomes a man, a gender, changes her gender to a male. And I presume that because there's not much problem with that. So if a trans man walks into a male toilet, it's not a problem for the men. And if they happen to be in the same sport, boxing or something like that, it wouldn't be a big problem for men. But on the other side, it's obviously some women feel threatened by it, in hospitals, in toilets, and in sport, So it's a difficult area, and we need to think about it because there may come a time that we have to, express our views, our opinions, and feel free to do so. I mean, here in the West, we have that freedom. Interestingly enough, I was just got here in Hindu or Buddhist countries, and I think also true in the Far East, there isn't this obsession with sex at all, And the funny thing is that in the East, Buddhist especially, there's a sort of myth that you're much better off to become enlightened if you happen to be born a man. So many women make the determination to be born a man in the next lifetime. And there was a case in Sri Lanka, which is the opposite, where a Catholic bishop became a Buddhist. And towards the end of his life, this is, I think, going back to the 60s, 50s, 60s, towards the end of his life, he determined that he wanted to be reborn as a woman. So he began dressing as a woman and sort of trying to change his gender before he died. Anyway, it really is just a case intellectually of, really being able to hold our views and opinions just a bit more lightly, to see them more as perspective. If you hold on to your views and opinions too strongly, I'm right and everybody else is wrong, then there's always conflict. But to be able to be open to critique, to have your views challenged, even nuanced, I mean, that's really takes courage. And then finally, we have the spiritual courage. And there's one little example here, which I think is it really affected me when I found this out. When the Inquisition started, and they attacked the Cathars, the Albigensians, down in the south of France, what's today's the south of France. There was an occasion where about some escaped from the first town that was attacked in Béziers, and they ended up in a place called Minerve, which was a heavily well-fortified small town with a river running through it, etc. And there was a certain Simon de Montfort who was really quite a cruel soldier. Anyway, they were eventually conquered, and he just kept lobbing stones at them, with a catapult. Anyway, when they finally collapsed and they entered into the town, they built a big bonfire, and 140 Cathars threw themselves onto the flames. That's courageous. And ironically, there is a monument to that right in front of the Catholic Church. So I thought that's a bit cheeky. So in our actual spiritual practice, there is, remember, this whole process of renunciation, of letting go, letting go, letting go. And really, this idea of Nibbana, it's a sort of shady idea. The Buddha tells us it's the highest happiness. It's absolutely, you want it when you got it, but we don't know what it is. And in the Christian tradition, they talk of the mysterium tremendum and fascinans. So it's the mystery which is both frightening, makes you tremble, and yet it fascinates you. Yet you want to find out what it is. So it's going to take some courage, because it's like you're walking backwards towards a cliff. There's a drop coming somewhere. You've got to let go of everything at some point, but you don't know when it's coming, and you haven't a clue what's going to happen when you actually fall off the cliff. So there's a bit of anxiety, fear, existential anxiety around the whole process of spiritual practice. So again, whenever that sort of fear comes up, we just turn to it, the usual thing, give a hug. It's only trying to protect us, and make a determination to continue with our practice. So these 6 areas just give us a way of examining the whole idea of timidity when fear comes, and courage. There is another side to this, which I'll tackle on another talk, and that, of course, is the courage of forbearance, the courage of patience. And the Buddha has a lot to say about that. Yeah, very good. So I can only hope my words have been of some assistance, that I have not caused confusion, and that by your ability to stay with fear, to overcome fear, you will be liberated from all suffering sooner rather than later.